Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and apologies for the brief delay there. Just a few technical difficulties, which have nearly solved. We've definitely got our two guests. And yes, you heard me right. I said two guests. My first proper main historian guest is Ellin Bessner. She was on previously about 2 years ago now, talking about Canadian cemeteries in Normandy and the Jewish soldiers who were buried there. But she's coming on today to address the fact that, well, Canadian troops were part of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. But she's brought with her a second guest, Bob Delson, and I'll let Ellin herself introduce our second guest, but I'm going to bring Ellin in right now. Good afternoon, Ellin. How are you today?
We are well in very, very cold Canada, lots of wind chill, but it's very great to be here with you and your audience on such an important topic. Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you. And, you know, we missed International Holocaust Day, which was last week, but we're kind of using this show to acknowledge the fact that anniversary occurred, and we're bringing you back on because we liked you last time. And Ellin, tell us who Bob is.
Well, I'm so honored to have with us Bob Delson from Toronto. Bob is 80 years old, and he is the son of one of the Canadian Air Force men who liberated Bergen-Belsen. And we're very glad to have Bob because Bob has a treasure of photos and artifacts that the world has not seen yet in terms of the military history world from his father's scrapbooks, which he never talked about. And his father, of course, passed away. And so in honor of the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as you said, we are going to talk about that. And Bob later on will give you his son's view of his father's service.
Yeah, and at the moment, Bob is still trying to get a PowerPoint ready to send to us. He's had internet problems, and anyway, we're with you now. So, Ellin and folks, we're going to do questions at the end today, just because that's how it's going to work. Because we're trying to work all these different things, Ellin and Bob talking, but we'll do questions at the end. Basically, over to you, Ellin, to take us through this extraordinary and very, very moving but very important story.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to just mention, and this is on behalf of Bob, but also myself, there are some graphic photos that you will see. And Paul, I think that we'll tell the guests when they're about to come up. So if it is triggering for you or you don't want to look, we'll tell you when you can look away. I've seen these photos many times, thanks to Bob helping me, and it's still hard to look at. So I just want to give that little warning to your audience.
Yep, thank you.
All right. So I'm so happy to be here. I want to, before we get started, acknowledge that if anyone who is watching is a veteran or had veteran in their families, thank you so much for your service. And please feel free in the chat below or to the side to let us know who they were and what they did. And it's an honor for me to have you alongside as we go through the presentation, which is how Canada's troops, especially the Jewish troops, liberated the Nazi death camps. As you said, Paul, of course, we're 1 week out. A week ago today was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And that is the 78th anniversary of January the 27th, when Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Now, most of the people who were murdered by the Nazis, of course, in Auschwitz were Jews. There was 1.1 million people murdered in Auschwitz. Almost 90% were Jewish. And so over the last Friday, many of you maybe have participated or saw it on the news. Countries around the world saw the memorials. In Canada, this is what ours looked like in Ottawa at the National War Memorial, where the politicians, Prime Minister Trudeau, the opposition leaders, and Holocaust survivors gathered to say never again and to pledge to wipe out anti-Semitism. In New York at the United Nations, this is an incredible display. It was unveiled on January the 27th. This is a book of names. It's 2 meters by 8 meters of names of the 4.8 million Jews who were murdered out of the 6 million. Why the discrepancy, Woody? Because they don't have all the names and backgrounds of everyone else, especially children or people who were not counted in the Nazis' very meticulous registration. But so they're hoping to be able to still add to that in the future. But as we know, COVID, this horrible Holocaust survivors, many of them died. There's very, very few still left. And time is running out to find out who they were. But this is at the United Nations. It comes from Yad Vashem, which is in Jerusalem, the repository and memorial for the Holocaust. I didn't know if anyone is aware, but there is a Canadian who was murdered in Auschwitz during the Holocaust, a Canadian victim, maybe the only Canadian in that we know of who died as a Jewish victim of the Nazis. And I'll tell you a bit about him. This is from the Montreal Holocaust Museum. His name was Harry Cohen, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time because Harry was originally from Poland. He came to Canada, as many of our family, many of the Jewish people in Canada's ancestors came over either before World War I or in between World War I and World War II. And he came from Poland in the 1920s. He set up his family in Montreal. He had a business. He was in the poultry business. So what he would do was take his wagon and go to the farms up to Ottawa and meet the farmers, get their chickens, and then come back to Montreal and sell them at the market. Then, unfortunately, bad timing for him, he had some family business to take care of back in Poland in the summer of 1939. So he went back to Poland. And you all know that, of course, in September, Hitler invaded Poland, and he was trapped. He was hidden by a Christian family for a while, but we don't know how he was betrayed. And then he was also deported and murdered at Auschwitz. No one knows any of the details. How we know this is because after the war, the Christian family who hid him sent this talit, this prayer shawl, back to Montreal. They had the address. And so this is now in the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I'm still getting goosebumps talking about it, as the only Montreal Canadian person who actually died at Auschwitz that we know of.
And Ellin, just to jump in here, how important is it to bring artifacts to the public? Because, you know, we have this problem stupidly with Holocaust denial and things like that, which we're not going to go down that rabbit hole of discussing that. But for
we are later, actually, we are.
Okay, well, good. We're not, you know, for people to actually see these artifacts in the museum, it is that actual reminder that these things did happen. Now, I know it sounds stupid saying, reminding people that did happen, but there are people out there, and I do get the odd nasty apologist, you know, pop up on my comments and, you know, saying that we're overplaying it and the Wehrmacht weren't at all bad people and blah, 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 blah. So as someone yourself who does an incredible lot of work, blogging and lecturing and presenting and writing, and I'm holding up your book there about Double Threat, the people do have these tangible links with it, and we'll get to Bob's photos later on. How important is it to see this stuff practically and see it in person?
Well, you're right, because there is a lot of Holocaust, and I was going to get into it later, but we might as well talk about it for a minute now. 22% of young people in Canada, millenniums and Gen Z, do not know or are not sure that the Holocaust happened. A new survey came out a couple of years ago, and so they hadn't heard about it or they have questions. In our capital, maybe some of you remember the Freedom Convoy that took over Ottawa last winter, a year ago this coming week. For 3 weeks, they wanted to protest against vaccine mandates, but they had swastikas, they had Nazi flags, and they were saying that Jews are the same from the Holocaust as they are, because they have to have this vaccine passports in order to go to work. So they were wearing these yellow stars to protest the government's requirement for them to get vaccinated, which is obscene. You cannot compare this, but this is what, and I could go on and on. We'll talk more about it. So the fact that actually Bob will talk about witnesses, photos, and artifacts that his father personally saw, and these museums is really important because people can touch it, they can see it, and it's school children can go and tour. And there's thousands of these tours that are happening in Canada because there's 4 museums now coming up where they're getting renovated and they're about to reopen to show students so they can fight anti-Semitism. Because, as we're going to talk about right now, when you think about the Second World War, the Holocaust started with words, such as the Holocaust did not happen, and we're hearing this again. So I'm going to move on now and talk about why we're mentioning the liberators, because everybody thinks about the Holocaust as the victims. And there were 44,000 lagers, ghettos, transit camps, concentration camps, and death camps in continental Europe and North Africa that the Nazis ran. This is Riviera San Saba in Trieste, Italy, where I was visiting, and it has, of course, crematoriums. Nobody knows that there's a death camp in northern Italy, but there is. And you know, the reason that it's so important is we know about how the Jewish community responded. There was maybe 1.1 million Canadian service personnel who went to fight in the Second World War. 40% of all eligible Canadians went. The Canadian Jewish community was really small, 1% of the population, 163,000 people. That's it, including people who had just come over, like Harry Cohen. And yet they sent 40% to the war because, as far as they were concerned, this was the most important war they could fight. Yes, for freedom. Yes, for democracy. But they were fighting to save their family members from annihilation back in Europe. And so that's one of their motivations for going. And they didn't know about Auschwitz. They didn't know yet about the extent to which they had camps and the massacres, but they did know that their relatives were not coming back from roundups, from Kristallnacht. Their letters weren't getting sent, and there were newspaper reports about it eventually. So they went because they wanted to save their own people from, and their whole culture from being erased, which is what the Hitler final solution was, starting in 1942 with the Wannsee Conference, a little bit before that, actually. The other thing that was very important is that it wasn't just Jews in Europe that were in danger. This is a book that Hitler had on his night table, and the Canadian Library and Archives bought it a few years ago because it shows the extent to which Nazi spies and fascist sympathizers knew where the Jews of the world were. This book shows, in German, all the Canadian major cities on the left column. On the middle column is the population. And on the right is how many Juden, how many Jews are in each of these: Toronto, London, Montreal, Winnipeg, Halifax. And so it brings it home that it wasn't just an over there war. This was going to be a war here too in Canada, which is why they went. Yet there was so much anti-Semitism in Canada as well, in the military and in the governments and in universities. Jews weren't allowed to go to couldn't go to medical school. There were quotas. You couldn't buy a house if you were Jewish in certain parts of the country. And so signing up as a Jew was really dangerous because not only it caused problems for you getting into a regiment, but if you got caught on the battlefield as a Jew and they found your pay book, they found your dog tags or your ID disc, your fate would be very dark indeed. Rabbi Captain David Monson from Toronto used to go. He was one of the Canadian overseas chaplains who was with the troops. But before he went, he told the boys that if the Christians lose the war, they will become Hitler's slaves. But if the Jews lose the war, they will become soap. And so that is one of the things he used to tell them, so they would go and enlist. So Canada declared war 9 days after Britain did, not September 1st. They waited a week or two to do a robust debate in Parliament. The Jewish community enlisted. They had their own special recruiting centers because, as I said, they couldn't get in many of the regiments. The Navy wouldn't take many Jews. There was a lot that wouldn't take them. So they had World War I veterans to help them navigate these interviews, and they signed up in droves. We had very, very motivated Jews. This is a fighter pilot from Toronto, Gordon Steinberg, who, instead of like a Marilyn Monroe type pinup, or it would have been Betty Grable at the time, he had a Jewish star on the nose cone of his plane over the Mediterranean. This is the most decorated, famous Canadian Jewish war hero, actually one of the most famous Canadian war heroes of World War II. And as all things Canadian, he's a hockey player because that's what we love here, not football or soccer, hockey. This is Mo Hurwitz, Sergeant Mo Hurwitz, MM and DSM. He was offered a position to try out to play for the Boston Bruins. And he said, how could I go and play hockey when millions of my brethren are being killed? So he turned down the tryout, which would have been a huge thing for him. And he joined the Grenadier Guards, 22nd Armored, and he became a tank driver. Sadly, when he was killed in 1943 in October when they were clearing out the Scheldt, but his brother was a POW. And so that was another motivation to go and fight, because he had to rescue his brother Harry, who was on the Athabaskan in April 44. Canadian Jews served in most of the branches. As I see here, you'll see that none in the Navy, hardly. There were most in the Army, lots in the Air Force, because Jews were well educated, so they wanted them as navigators or what have you. And a couple hundred were in other forces, including the British. And then there were 90 in the Merchant Marine, and 2,000 didn't put down their religion for obvious reasons, to be safe. So all this takes us to D-Day, and 14,000 Canadian troops land on the beaches of Normandy. And then they come full throttle, full exposure to the actual truth of what happened to their Jewish families, to the Jews of Europe. And this is where we come to the camps and to the encounters. So the world by April, May, June of 44 knew what was happening at Auschwitz. So how did they know? I just did a podcast about it. And the reason the world knew is because of this man. And he was a soldier too, so I'm going to explain the connection. And he was Canadian at the end of his life. Rudolf Verba. There's a new book out by Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian called The Escape Artist. When he lived in Auschwitz, he survived as a teenage slave for 2 years after being deported to Auschwitz from Slovakia, first Majdanek, then Slovakia. He was working on the ramps, unloading the trains. He was working in the warehouse called Canada with a K, where all the possessions and the jewels and the suitcases were being sorted. And he was an amazing mathematician, even though he was 17 when he got in and 19 when he did what no one else did. He and another man escaped from Auschwitz and made it to Slovakia after an 11-day flight with his head full of all the transports, how many died, from what countries, what dates, and plans and layouts of the camp. And then he and his friend dictated it in a 32-page report that then eventually got to Churchill, the Pope, Roosevelt, the media, and the world knew exactly what was going on. We're talking 2 months, 3 months before D-Day. Nobody did anything about it, partly because they didn't want to. That's a whole other story, which left him bitter for the rest of his life. But also because they just didn't believe it, because what Verba said was the Nazis were successful because they tricked the Jews. They told them they were going to be resettled in the East. So they brought their pots and pans, and they brought their prams, and they brought all their luxury goods. They didn't know that they were going to be murdered the minute they got off the trains. And Verba wanted everyone to know so that they would revolt. At least they would try to panic and sort of throw a wrench into the death machine at Auschwitz. That did not happen. However, he did manage to save 200,000 Hungarian Jews from deportation, because then the Allies started bombing Hungary to pressure them not to let 800,000 Jews be deported. They were the last big group. And so even though he saved 200,000, because Sir Martin Gilbert credited him with them, he then joined the Slovakian partisans and eventually moved to Canada after the war, became a celebrated medical professor at UBC. But he felt that he had failed because the world didn't listen. Okay, this is all happening. And then we get towards the operation, which the Canadians, the British, Operation Pheasant, Canadians, British, and the Polish were supposed to clear out the North Brabant in Holland. And why I'm talking about this is because there is a great story about a Canadian who was one of the ones who liberated the camp. It's in Sertingenbosch. It's called Camp Vught. It was actually an SS-run Nazi concentration camp. And 30,000 people went through there on their way to Sobibor and other camps, but it was also had a crematorium. I went there to look at it. It's still a national monument. They did have a crematorium. They punished political prisoners. Lots of people died. It was a brutal camp. And of course, many, many Jews went through there. Now, why am I telling you about this place? 1,300 children were deported. It's all we know about this because of Private Jack Marcovitch. Private Jack Marcovitch was from Montreal. He was 19 years old. He was a hefty guy, a plumber, and he was a member of the Régiment de la Chaudière. And they were there. And they didn't have to fight to take it over because the camp was abandoned when they got there. There was several transports out. But what happened was one day he saw, they were there stationed in the area for a couple of weeks before they moved on. And one day he saw one of his comrades washing a Jeep with a blue and white silk fringed rag. Remember I showed you Harry Cohen's prayer shawl. So Jack freaked out. He ran down to the guy and said, "What do you? Where did you get this? This is not a rag. This is a Jewish holy object." And his comrade told him, "Oh, there's storerooms full of this stuff in the camp." So Jack found storerooms full of talitot, and also he found prayer books. There's the prayer book that he found.
Wow.
And he wanted to save all of them. He wanted to save them all, his children told me, hence the title of our talk. But they were moving on, so his CO said, "Take one of each." And that's what he did. And there's the prayer book. And there's what it says. Now, normally Christian people, I know you have Bibles where you write the name on the left when you were married and then each child. This is what this is. But nobody ever did anything with it. He kept it in lovingly for the rest of his life until, of course, me investigating. And I found the family who it belonged to. That's the prayer shawl. That's his son wearing the prayer shawl, visiting me, Don Marcovitch. And Don brought me the book in my home a few years ago. So this is the family whose prayer book it was. They were the Kahn family. They were butchers, just like my family was butchers. So it was very, very, even more goosebumpy and horrible. They were from Valkenburg. The parents were on the right, Elise and Daniel Kahn. They had 4 adult children. They all died except 2. One, the baby, jumped off the train. And another one the daughter was put into a convent, and she survived the war. They never knew that their Jewish soldier who came to the camp where their family died found their prayer book until I found the granddaughter. And I went to Elst in Arnhem, near Arnhem and Nijmegen, I should say. And I told her, and I brought the pictures. And then Dan, the son of this soldier, the one I showed you the picture, he had made a video to thank them and to say hello. And here's what we did for your family. She's not Jewish because her mother was in a convent and stayed Christian, but she's now exploring her roots. The side problem, Paul, is that they don't want to give the prayer book back. The family thinks that it should stay with the father's family who rescued it, the soldier, and they don't want to give it back. So it's a bit of a touchy situation, and the camp wants it back too. But I tried, so I let it go. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you about this story is because next we go to the advance on the Northern Front towards. Okay, the British got to go up the middle. That's the red dotted lines. The Americans got to go to Berlin, and the poor Canadians said, "No, you can't have anything. Go up and liberate up to the North Sea, and that's it." So the Canadians got to go up and do that. Jack was furious with what he'd seen. Eventually, they got to joyous welcomes by the freed Dutch people, and the Jewish soldiers were there looking for survivors. That's Rabbi Samuel Cass, who I will tell you about in a minute. And a lot of these men, I know personally in my book, they actually were there liberating the camps. They were at this Jewish service in just across the Rhine in March of 1945 in Cleve. After April 1st, when the Canadians, I told you they had to go north, the British and the Canadians were all then stationed near Bergen-Belsen, which was the death camp where Anne Frank was killed and her family. This is what happened on April. There was no fighting. It was a negotiated takeover. Mm-hmm. The camp had 60,000 survivors. They were emaciated. They were sitting there with typhus and terrible diseases. And there were 20,000 unburied corpses. As you'll hear soon, Bob's going to show you what his father saw. The British came in, and the Germans told them, "Oh yeah, there's just a few hundred cases of typhus. It's fine." But it was a massive humanitarian crisis. Anne Frank died of typhus maybe 2 or 3 weeks before their liberation. And guess what? Our friend Jack Marcovitch was there too. And we know because British Pathé filmed it. And here he is arresting the beast of Belsen, the Commandant Joseph Kramer. What do you notice about Kramer's uniform? He's a commandant of the worst camp that everyone was literally dying or dead. What's wrong with his uniform? It doesn't have any insignia. There's no why do you think that is?
Because as a big coward, he's trying to hide as somebody else, because they're not these horribly barbaric, evil bastards are they're not even proud enough, is that not the right word, to admit who they are. They're trying to hide, because all bullies are essentially cowards, aren't they? So he's trying to save his own sorry ass, isn't he?
Right. And so what ended up happening is there's Jack Marcovitch, and I can't show you the film, but I've sent
the link to the film is in the description below, folks, so you can watch that at your convenience.
It's a silent film, but it shows him at the camp arresting the beast. He was so angry he wanted to shoot him, and the British officer to the top left with the beret above Kramer said, "Don't shoot him, take him," because they wanted to, keep him for the war crimes trials. There's Jack, literally. There's Jack Marcovitch, our Jewish liberator, and the beast of Belsen. And eventually, in December of that year, Kramer was tried, convicted, and put to death for his crimes at Belsen. So he never spoke about this. Jack never spoke about this. As you'll hear from Bob, his father never spoke about it either. And there was 40 years later, the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, did an interview with him when this same film was then broadcast in a documentary on TV. You see those 1980s couches and TVs. I used to have one of those too. And I'm going to read to you one thing, what he said. He said, the stench, it was unbelievable. Do you know what they were doing in that place? It was mass killing of ordinary human beings. But 1,000 Canadians were attached to the camp after liberation, at least according to Mark Sellensack, who's I know you've had him on before, a Canadian expert on the Belsen camp. And I have a family connection too. On the right is Reverend Leslie Hardman. He was a rabbi, he was a chaplain, and very famous in England, and that's my husband's family. He was there 2 days or 3 days after Belsen was liberated, and he saw 20,000 unburied bodies and told, first of all, they commandeered all the bulldozers were bulldozing him, and he stopped them, and he said, no, they need a dignified burial. So here he is with a Christian chaplain giving a prayer service over the bodies at mass grave 2. But that's not just, the physical things that they help them with. They also help them spiritually. There's a prayer service in Belsen after a couple of months where the rabbi is doing a prayer service in May. There were Canadian nursing sisters who were helping, including Estelle Tritt. What she did was her mother would send her letters from people in the States looking for relatives, and she would go to the refugee centers, the Red Cross in Europe, and see if she could find any survivors and, hook them up. So because they couldn't go back to live in Poland or wherever they'd come from, there was nothing for them. So they were trying to help them move to the United States or Canada. Mo Rezin was an RCF photographer, and he met these women survivors, and there was no postal service that was working in the state, of course, in Poland and in Germany. So what he did, the Army's postal service was working and the Air Force's postal service was working. So these women survivors of Belsen gave him the names of people and letters, and he would mail them to the last, known address of their relatives. But he also was told, and here's, the picture, sorry. It says on the back, distributing some chocolates, candies, cigarettes, etc. He wrote, forbidden to give them substantial food. That's him, second from left. Because they would die. And in fact, 17,000 people did die in the camps after liberation because they were too weak to continue from the maltreatment. A couple last things before I bring in Bob. There was a massive program by the Canadian personnel who were stationed nearby at Celle, I hope I said it right, where they got their families to send care packages, but not just like cans of food, but things like stockings for the ladies, red lipstick and combs to make them feel human. And that's what was done by Stanley Winfield from Calgary, who was Jewish, and his squadron leader, who was not. Then Bernard Yale took pictures of the orphans at Belsen, and he used to bring them ice cream every Sunday and take them on picnics. And there's one other thing that I should tell you about. There were war artists in Canada who were members of the RCAF, including Abba Bayevsky, who was 22. This is a picture of him later in life, of course. And he was sent to Belsen in May, and he would do war art that haunted him for the rest of his life. This boy on the right died the day after he did this picture. One final camp that the Canadians liberated was Westerbork. It was 3 days before Belsen, which is where Anne Frank's family were. And Westerbork was a transit camp. And Rabbi Samuel Cass, who I mentioned to you earlier, he went there. It was again a negotiated takeover. The Nazis had left. There was maybe 700 Jews still at the camp. And he did prayer services for them. And they stayed there to nourish their souls as well as their bodies. And they had parties for the orphans. This is in Belgium at Hanukkah. So that's the first part of our presentation, Paul. And now I'm so honored if we could bring in our special guest, Bob Delson, because Bob's father was one of the liberators of Belsen, and his story is incredible. So I'm honored to introduce Bob.
Hi, Ellen. Hi, Woody. How are you?
We're good.
Welcome to all. Ellen, you did receive an email about a few minutes ago with
we've got them.
We got them. Here we are. We got them.
Okay, good. Okay,
so we're going to do a little Q&A. I'm going to have the honor of helping Bob with some questions that I think you as the audience would want to ask anyway. We're going to start off, Bob. Bob just turned 80, by the way. Happy birthday, Bob.
Happy birthday, Bob.
Thank you.
And I want you to introduce us a little bit. Tell us about your father's family and how he ended up there. They ended up coming to Canada, as many Jewish people were. They were immigrants from Europe.
Well, as you can see in the first picture, Dad's family came from Russia, Lithuania, with his 2 daughters and his wife. This picture was taken after they landed in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. In 1918, just before Dad was born in Bridgewater. My grandfather, Zadie Max, was a cobbler in Russia. He continued to do some of that when he came here. He was looking for freedom. He was looking for a country to live in that he can enjoy and bring up his family. He moved into Bridgewater for a short bit. My father was born in 1918, and still unsure of how the Tsar might find him, he moved himself and his family to Saskatchewan, Canada. Out west was pretty desolate, but he felt it was safe. But following that, he felt he needed a little bit more community around him. So he moved the family to Montreal, Canada, where Dad did all his growing up.
Okay.
Ellen?
Yes. So I want to ask you, when were you born? And then we'll talk next about when the war broke out, what was your dad doing?
Okay. I was born in 1942 on December 9th. Dad was still overseas. I was brought up or looked after by my father's sisters and, of course, my mother. And we were growing up and waiting for Dad to come back and join us, who I had never seen.
Okay, so you said he went overseas. Why did he enlist, and when did he enlist?
Dad enlisted in 1941. He was trained in Montreal. He was trained to be a mechanic, which was actually a rigger, people who outfitted planes, repaired planes, and they flew and tested them to see if they were okay. Took them overseas, and he joined the 438 squadron called the Wildcats, where it's a well-known squadron to this day. He was stationed in England, and when he got overseas, and he joined all the crew and the squadron over there.
Now, your father was a rigger, but he was also important job, which is why you have all these amazing photos, is he was a photographer, reconnaissance photographer too.
In between his repairs and outfitting and rigging, he also was sent up to take pictures where they could for reconnaissance to help the soldiers find what's going on the ground, what's happening, and so on and so forth. So he brought back a whole pile of wonderful pictures, some disturbing pictures, but he brought it back for everybody to see.
All right. Now, I know that this album, that you found all this, you didn't know any of this, but these are contained in an album which traces his steps through Europe. Tell me where he was until he got to Holland.
Well, one dad got overseas from England. He went there it is, and he was in Normandy. He was there on the day of the bombing in Normandy. I think the next picture shows the tracers and the planes bombing. That there they are there, D-Day in Normandy. Dad was there briefly, and he was then on his way through Europe with the squadron through Normandy off into France. As they went through France, they ended up in an abandoned aircraft field called L'Hôtel, Base 89. The Air Force didn't have any hangars. Whatever they saw were abandoned farm fields, barns, things of that nature. But all the repairs and all the service work they had to do was outside. Whether it was winter or summer, they were out there fixing and repairing and outfitting planes. From L'Hôtel, they went into Corelli, which is in France, and from Corelli, they headed off into parts of Holland, and their first stop in Holland was Eindhoven. In Eindhoven, they were welcomed by the people in Eindhoven as they felt the people in Holland loved the Canadians, thought they only thought good things of them because the Canadians were there to save them. Unfortunately, the night of January 5th, 1945, Eindhoven was surprise attacked by the Germans. Dad was there while the Germans bombed and destroyed 250 Typhoons and a serious loss of airmen, including soldiers. The Hellcats departed from Eindhoven and traveled to Arnhem. Arnhem is where the troops, I should say, regrouped, put everything together, and went after the Germans for the first and last advance on the German army, Air Force, and whoever was in their way. That was the final blow for Germany. One small note, in Arnhem, the actual movie called The Bridge Too Far was filmed many years later. And Arnhem was a very important victory for the Allied troops. From there,
Oh, no, he's back.
Okay, we're about to move towards Bergen-Belsen. And so, Bob, we're going to warn people now, are we not, that this next bunch of photos is very graphic.
Before we do that, I want to just ask Bob a question, because I want to bring some context in here, because the World War II TV regulars know that, and Norma's watching it, is that the Canadian Army, as you know, it went from 44 to 45. Morale was pretty low generally. The winter was terrible. It was wet. It was cold. There's a growing sense within the British and Commonwealth forces in Europe that, you know, why can't this damn war be over soon? Why are we all still here? Why can't we be replaced by someone else? Do you know what the mood was within your dad's unit? Obviously, this terrible attack by the German aircraft on the base, on the Typhoons there, but was morale at an all-time low, or were they kind of what do you think it was going on with your dad and his friends at that time?
Well, Dad didn't speak much about it, but if you go back to the picture where he was outfitting a plane, I think you passed it a few shots back. There he is. Oh, there's the shot. This is how they had to outfit planes. This is where they were working. This is how they worked every day. Their thoughts were moving forward, how they had to get everything going and get this war over. When I spoke to Dad about it, he spoke little about it. He was very. It was an atrocity to him, and you'll see as we go forward. Now we get into the Bergen camp. You'll see what he saw as he walked into the camp with the rest of his squadron, and you can feel, what he felt. Here's what he saw as he walked through the roads into the camp where they came in by truck. bodies on the lines on the side of the road, just thrown helter-skelter all over the place. Some were alive, not too many. Most of them were dead. You want to pass the next picture?
Yep.
This is the beginning of the camps and where they found the grave sites. And this is where the prisoners were kept, very, very, very shabby conditions. They unfortunately had very little amenities, that's for sure. It was a horrible sight. You can go to the next picture. This is another grave site. And if we pass on to the next picture, these are the soldiers who are preparing the bodies for burial. But if you go to the next picture, you will see the grave sites. And this is where the Germans threw human beings, helter-skelter, into holes in the ground where human beings did not deserve to be. It was disgraceful. And this is what Dad saw. And the stench and the smell of this was just horrible. This is the second grave site. This is number 9. Or 7, I should say. And again, bodies were just thrown into this hole and just left to die, or they were already dead. Go to the next picture, please. There we go. The soldiers then had their job ahead of them, and they had to prepare the bodies, to wrap the bodies, to bury them, so they would have at least a decent burial from all the atrocities that they had suffered in this camp. Bear in mind that Belsen was not a camp where these prisoners were killed. This is a place where they sent them just to die. You want to go to the next picture?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
And these are rows and rows of bodies, all put in shrouds, prepared and ready to be buried. Most of them without markings, no names. They were just unmarked graves.
Okay, now I need to come back in because this is a very important stitch. So your father encountered the dead. He encountered how the German troops were forced to be burial parties by the Allies, but also how I mentioned, Rabbi Hardman was making sure that they did it properly with dignity as much as they could. But then your father encountered an actual survivor. And tell me about this piece of cloth and where you found it and who he was.
Well, I found this piece of cloth, the Jewish star as it was known, in Dad's album. I pulled it out and I showed it to him, and he said this was given to him by a prisoner in the camps. The prisoner approached him. He was wearing his striped outfit as he had to wear. And he approached Dad and he tore this star off his chest. He was finally free. Handed it to Dad and wrote his name on it and said he thanked him for his freedom and he was lucky to be alive. The man's name who did this, I think it's the following picture. There it is. His name we found out later, was Leo Rothschild. He was a freedom fighter. He had been in many camps. Leo had escaped from camp after camp until finally he ended up in Belsen. And of course, his destiny was going to be death until, of course, the Canadian or the Allied forces came through and liberated him.
Wow.
And he was Belgian. And how did you find out how what the name was and where all this information?
Well, the name was, he wrote his name pretty haphazardly, of course, on the Jewish star. And my friend Ellin Bessner and myself, mostly Ellin, was able to research and look into her archives because I did not have the archives that she had. And we were able to look and find where this man had lived. He did go back to his town. Of course, he didn't stay there very long, as the records show. And of course, he has passed on since then.
Right. And he's a well-known partisan in the Brussels Holocaust Museum.
Correct. But he was a freedom fighter throughout Europe.
So next slides, I'd like to sort of delve a little bit more. None of this stuff you knew. Paul, the most interesting thing, I think, is the journey that Bob went on.
Yeah.
Because here he was, a little boy. He'd never met his father. And then his father comes home. Tell us what it was like for you to be the son of a father that had been to the camp and suffered PTSD?
Well, if you get down to the last picture on this package, there I am. One picture back, yeah. That's me waiting for my father when he came home. I was 5 years old. I was a little boy. My socks down on my legs, my pants hanging down a bit. But I was a little boy in Montreal waiting for him. He came home on October 2nd, 1944. And he didn't know me, of course. And I really didn't know him. It was a very strange relationship. I wasn't too sure if on my memories exactly who this was and why he was here. I later found out, and through more pictures, which I'm now doing an autobiography on, I have more pictures to show what effect the war had on my father, which then generated down to me and stays with me as I live today.
Now, one of the things that's so fascinating, I think maybe it's 45 that he meant. That might be a little typo, but
I think I may have made a mistake on 44.
yeah, it must, because we didn't discover the camp for another 6 months. But
Right.
how has discovering what your father went through, Bob, changed your appreciation for why you grew up the way you did?
Well, Ellen, I didn't have much of a family life because my father left my mother when he came, probably, I'm guessing, probably within a year or so after he came home. And I lived with my mother and my two aunts, my father's sisters, who brought me up. I can honestly say that my memories from there on in were great when I was with my aunts, not so great when I was at home with my mother. A lot of the anxiety, a lot of the feelings that I had were within me for the many years that I grew up. My father remarried when I was 12, and I then transferred myself into a new environment. However, my feelings were still the same and still hidden from everything around me until I met my wife. My wife enabled a family for me. We had 3 children, and we now have 5 grandchildren. My children have really brought things into focus for me just recently when they gave me a surprise party for my 80th birthday. And they said to me that they thanked me for giving them a life and a family and some guidance for them to go forward, which is something I never had as a child. And
Well, you can understand now that your dad was suffering from what he'd been through, I'm sure, right?
Totally, totally. Until the day he passed, there was never any large words, serious words about what happened. But Dad was, beyond all of this, Dad was he was very creative. As you can see in the picture, that's the album that he brought, one of the albums he brought back, which he hand wrote and he drew on. He was very, very creative. He brought pastel pictures of airplanes. Was it Ava Gardner, who was one at the camps as one of the visitors entertaining the troops? He drew a charcoal of her, and which I'm accumulating now to show a big collage of all the things that he did. But it's still, even to this day, there's still something that's unspoken. Dad passed, and he took whatever else he had with him, but a lot of it still remains with me. And I know there's many, many other people, children of the soldiers that came back from the war. I'm sure they faced the same thing.
We're going to just sorry, Bob, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, I want you to tell, speaking about children, there's this time delay. I'm sorry, and I talked over you. I apologize. Speaking about children, and I want you to finish off by telling the audience and Paul what you're going to be doing as your new volunteer job, that you'll be telling the story that children can hear it. It's very, very important. As we go back to the beginning when Paul said, kids don't understand. I told you 22% of the young people don't know that the Holocaust happened, or they don't understand. So tell us what you're going to be doing with all your father's stuff.
Well, I've been approached by the Holocaust Museum, the new Holocaust Museum in Toronto, and we're discussing putting my father's album and the stories of my father as many soldiers into the new museum with the pictures that we brought back, including the Jewish star. And I'll be, right now we're still in the works, but I believe I will be one of the presenters in the museum. When people come through, I'll be talking to them about what my father went through, what the war was all about. And there was a war, and there was a devastation, and there was something that people really, really didn't know about, but the children today have to carry it through. I know my children know about it. I know that my grandchildren question about it, although it's not really something that's in their minds often. But it's something that the Holocaust Museum in Toronto will carry forward, and it'll give me the opportunity to speak to people about it.
So that's incredible thing. And Paul, we're going to send it back to you. Thank you so much, Bob, for this great presentation. And then I guess you have some questions, or maybe your audience has, and I want to wrap up as well at the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, my thoughts I want to kind of put into it, to everybody now, is that going back to what I said at the beginning about Holocaust denial and what have you, is that we're in danger of talking about it as all the victims are long since gone. But the fact is, as you said, the effects of it are still totally around today, because it's the kids, the survivors, the children of the survivors, the grandchildren of the survivors, the grandchildren of the people who liberated the camps, all that massive spider's web of connection. I mean, I did a show about a year ago with Dirk Bogart's biographer, and Dirk Bogart, as an RAF officer, visited the camps, and it changed the rest of his life. His life was in two phases: before seeing what the Nazis had done, and after seeing what the Nazis have done. He did sketches and things, and it was something he was trying to deal with for his life. So, you know, everybody watching this, everybody who watches this later on, we all know someone who was directly or indirectly affected by the Holocaust. That's the thing. There's someone in the street everywhere where you are, folks, who is a descendant of someone who was affected by this. So we must get out of this idea of saying that the victims have all long since departed. The actual murder victims have maybe long since departed, but the victims of PTSD and the memories of this are still very much with us. That's where my thought is at the moment. Folks, if you have any questions for Ellin or Bob, far away. Ellin, you wanted to make a couple of points there, didn't you?
I did just want to talk about what you said. Bob said that he's going to be telling the story, but his grandchildren have questions. This is a photo I mentioned earlier, the Freedom Convoy, which was the anti-COVID vaccine, and their swastikas on flags. And there was Confederate flags. And I just want to tell you, I don't know if your audience realizes that anti-Semitism is so strong now around the world that in Canada, for the 7th straight year, increased by 7% the anti-Semitism incidents. And we're talking everything from, like I just showed you, to kids in schools are doing the swastika and Heil Hitler salute to torment Jewish students. In Ottawa, for example, 2 kids were just arrested and charged with hate and mischief. There were 2,799 incidents of hate speech, mischief, graffiti, and threats against Jews last year in Canada, according to B'nai B'rith. In our country, there are armed guards at every synagogue and Jewish school and institution, because they have to have security, because it's too dangerous for us to just worship without. And you saw what happens if you looked last week on the 27th of January, when the whole world was celebrating, or not celebrating, terrible word, commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And, 7 Jews were killed coming out of a synagogue in Jerusalem. So we can install cameras, and we can bring and fences, and we can put guards, and we don't put our Jewish, we don't wear Jewish stars outside to display it anymore, because it's dangerous in Canada to do that. But so it's a very scary time, and that's why this story is so important, because it does start with words and symbols, and that's what the survivors have always told us. But the good news is that we do have allies. Canada last spring outlawed Holocaust denial. The government also is helping to pay for the museum that Bob is going to be working at, and one's in Montreal, one's in Vancouver, one's in Winnipeg, and Ontario brought in mandatory Holocaust education in grade 6 starting in the fall. Why grade 6? Because that's when it starts. They're online and they see these memes and they see Kanye West saying going DEFCON 4 on Jews, and they see Kyrie Irving, saying that the Holocaust didn't happen. And so to sum up, I always say that for people like Bob's father and Mo Hurwitz and all the ones who didn't come home, we need to remember Holocaust Day, not just once a year, but every day is remembrance, because remembering is an active verb. So if you see something, say something. If you need to educate, march, protest, write a letter. If someone says an off-color joke, don't laugh. Tell them it's not appropriate and explain why. And so this is my ending message, is that our work is not done. And it's 78 years later, and our work is not done. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity.
Ellen, if I may say, going forward, I've joined the Baycrest Hospital, Sinai Health, in working with them to help people, feed people today with their Meals on Wheels, and people who are having problems handling and dealing with life in general. And this has been my focus now for the past 8 years. And it's really helping me to carry on with this way, to see that people can be helped. And the people, a lot of them are Holocaust survivors. People are children of Holocaust survivors. And we're looking after them to give them a future, and a solid future. Thank you.
We do have one question for you, Bob, from a viewer, which I've got to go back and find it now because I saw it there a minute ago. There we go, from Sean Brennan. And he's saying, did you or your father learn anything about PTSD while he was still alive? Or was the understanding of PTSD something you found out later?
PTSD is what I found out about life.
Right.
Dad shut everything out. And he came back, he married a much younger woman, brought up a whole new set of family. So PTSD wasn't in his word of knowledge. It became mine. Excuse me.
No problem.
So yes, but PTSD is probably what's brought me to the Baycrest Center, Sinai Health, to further some help with people who need it, and to stop all of this hatred that's in the world today.
I don't want to sort of spoil the term, but I want to go back to your photos and the star, because something occurred to me when you were talking about that, both of you, Ellin and Bob, is that Belgian freedom fighter who gave your father his Jewish star. Because the two thoughts that came to me were, and I welcome your comments. One is that's literally the only gift he can offer. He doesn't have anything else. He can't give a bunch of flowers. He can't give a meal. He can't, there's nothing he can do except hand over his star. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's also, there's a symbolism there, isn't it? By handing over that star he had been forced to wear for however many years, depending on where he was from, by handing it away, he's acknowledging to the liberators that he no longer has to identify himself as Jewish. Does that make sense to you? So I think that handing over that star was way more than just a kind of a thank you. It was a real rejection of having to be forced to label himself. Does that make sense with you, Ellin, as well?
It's not the first case of Jewish soldiers getting these stars. I've written in my book about many. One of them, unfortunately, was told, but he wanted to keep it. It was in Antwerp, and he was afraid because they were still fighting. He was with a recce unit, and he was afraid that if he got caught with this still, he would get into trouble. So his friends told him to throw it away, not get in trouble by his superiors, but be caught by the Nazis, because this was in Antwerp. So it was still early on in the war. It was in like September, October, right? And so he does, and to this day he regrets not having it.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's been an amazing presentation. Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something, Bob. Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry, Woody. The actual feeling I have of all of this, and my dad didn't say it, but I'm feeling that when he gave up the Jewish star, he accepted freedom. This giving the Jewish star was saying, here, I'm free, and please, this is who I am, and this is where I'll be.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one other thing, Bob. There was no guarantee that this man, Mr. Rothstein, was going to survive the next day. People were dropping dead all because of typhus and horrible things that were still at the camp. And he didn't know what else had happened in the rest of Europe that there were still Jews being persecuted in pogroms after the capitulation. Jews were still being hunted down and murdered in Poland. We know that there was a pogrom. So, you know, maybe he was also, remember me in case I don't make it, too. It was his only way. He didn't have ID. They had no ID. They had no paperwork. They had many. And you know what's horrible about this? The Canadians who, I don't know if we talked about this, but the British raised the camp. They destroyed it. They burned it because it was so unhealthy. And then I told you that they had to live there for another 5 years down the road. But many, many people stayed there for many years because there was no place for them to go. That's another thing. How do we even, how would you want to live where you just spent the most hellish time of your life and have to see it and go by it? And I know before we started the live, Paul, you gave a really good sort of anecdote that your mother had heard, and maybe you should tell it to
well, I mean, I'm not Jewish. I'm not religious at all. I'm from 50 miles northeast of London, so I have no direct connection whatsoever with the Holocaust at all. My only slight story is my mum, who was also 80. She was born in the war. Her father, my grandfather, was away, albeit he never left UK with the Royal Artillery. But my mum, in the early 60s, was a nanny in Germany working for a British Army officer of the 11th Hussars, I think it was. And she was incredibly homesick. I don't know how old she was, 19 or something. She was working as a nanny. And her dormitory building where she was for her room as part of the officers' quarters looked out over part of Bergen-Belsen, or what had been Bergen-Belsen. And she would remark how she would watch these flocks of birds fly over, but they would take this sharp detour as they went round this field that she could see, half a mile away from her window. And she asked the officer that she was working for, why do the birds do that? Why do they not fly over that bit over there? And he said, well, that was part of the camp. That was part of Bergen-Belsen camp. And he said, the birds don't fly over it. The birds will take this route where they will fly up to where the perimeter of the camp was, and then they will go around it. And I told that story to Alina Novobilska, who's done stuff about the Holocaust and World War II TV, and she said it was a common thing. And there's still these phenomenon of birds do not migrate over the sites of places like Auschwitz and Dachau and things like that. And that's now, whatever that is it magnetic fields in the earth? Is it the sense of evil? Is it something that has disturbed the birds and their migratory habits? Whatever it was, I don't understand the science or spiritual story behind it, but that's my only slight story. And I remember my mum telling me that story as a kid. I don't know how old I was. It was about the time I was learning about the Holocaust, I suppose. And it made it real. I mean, I hadn't been to Bergen-Belsen. I hadn't been anywhere like that. And it was only my mum telling me a story. She wasn't even there during the war. She was there 20 years later. And yet somehow it still was enough of a connection to make the Holocaust seem real to me. And I think that's what people like myself, in my limited way with this channel, you in a much greater way, Ellin, with your work and your podcasts and your talks, and Bob with all the work you're doing, you're just passing on the torch. You're making it real for people. That's the thing, because you can see as many infographics as you want with numbers and totals and figures, and this number went on this line and were murdered or exterminated this camp. That's just information. It's having a personal understanding of it by something hitting you in the heart and making it real. So that's my slight Bergen-Belsen story there. And people can maybe add something there. But I think we should think about rounding things off. But I want to cap it off with something. I think Bob is waiting to say something really worthy there. There's a look on Bob's face that Bob is going to sum it up with a fantastic end note there. So pressure on you there, Bob. But I feel there's something coming. So end it for us with something wise.
Well, you really know how to put a guy in the spot. That's okay.
Yeah, that's my job.
What I was really wanted to say was, I'm married to a daughter of two Holocaust survivors. And a lot of things that were brought to mind to me, which I thought I'd bring up now, is my mother-in-law spoke of, they were in Auschwitz. There was 9 brothers and sisters in the camps. Most of them were together. And about 2 weeks before the war ended, they couldn't find one of their sisters. And they were wandering around the camp yelling her name. True story, from the window, a little 12-inch square window, they heard her voice calling back. Each brother and sister got on each other's shoulders to make a human chain to get to the window and pulled her through to safety. She was 100 feet away from the gas chambers.
Wow.
And my mother-in-law told us a story with tears in her eyes. I mean, it was something. And I think that people have to remember, this is one of the things that I remember, and these are the things that drive me too, is that the things that I've heard, and then my mother-in-law's story, and seeing a woman who came out of the camps and had children and lived her life again, was a driving force for me as well, to bring it forward, to have people remember.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ellen. I think we will leave it at that. It's a subject we will return to, and I hope I return to it with both Bob and Ellen in the future. But right now, we will bring this in. And of all the shows we've done in this look at Canadians in World War II, they've all been brilliant. They've all been important, but this one has been slightly more important because it's an international message of remembrance and what we should all be doing to acknowledge those who were victims of such terrible brutality. So I hope, folks, you go away and you think about what we've been talking about today, and go and be proactive. Tell someone else about it. Share the link with this show. Buy Ellen's book. Go out there, sign a petition somewhere. Tell someone when you buy Ellen's book. Call people out when they tell an anti-Semitic joke, whatever it would be. But do something to pass on the message. So there we are, folks. I will see you all again tomorrow with Brad Sanquois, who's going to be talking about the Canadians and POWs in Hong Kong. But right now, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your brilliant questions. Thank you very much, Bob. You are a superstar. Thank you very much, Ellen. You're also a superstar. This is World War II TV saying thank you very much for paying attention. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers. Cheers.